Basically, I'm just confirming I am visible, right?
Yes, madam.
Okay, great.
Very good evening, everyone. I'm Rizla, a law undergraduate at the Faculty of Law, University of Colombo, and I'm so honored to be your moderator today. This webinar is a part of the International Youth Alliance for Peace series on gender-based violence. Talking about International Youth Alliance for Peace has been at the forefront of empowering young people and creating platforms for dialogue on pressing global issues. So, today's session is an extension of this mission as we examine gender based violence and explore ways to foster meaningful change in our communities under the topic of cultural narratives and gender based violence. So, talking about gender-based violence, it's something persistent issue that continues to affect millions of women worldwide. So, cultural narratives and societal tradition play a significant role in perpetuating this violence. And our goal today is to mainly discuss how we can address these issues while promoting positive change and women's safety. So, this discussion is timely and important for us as a community to understand the challenges and to seek challenge solution as well. So, a warm welcome to everyone here today, both in person and those joining via live stream. And thank you for taking part and thank you for your time to be part of this crucial conversation. And it's my great pleasure to now introduce our distinguished guest, speaker for today's test session, Ms. Sachinri PhD Dyers. And Ms. Sachinri is an attorney at law with an upper second class honors from the Faculty of Law, University of Colombo, and holds a master's in human rights and democratization. She has extensive experience in legal research, having worked in the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka, the Presidential Commission of Electoral Reforms, and several prestigious institutions. And we are so truly fortunate to have her with us today. And without further delay, now I would like to hand over to Ms. Sachindri to share her valuable insights. So, Ms. Sachindri, we're so excited to learn from you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rizla, for that wonderful introduction and warm welcome. I assume I'm audible and visible.
Yes, madam. Yes, madam.
Okay. Rizla, is there an option to share my screen if it is needed?
Yes, we can share through your settings and
Yeah. I
yes,
think
it's visible, ma'am. We can see that.
okay, great. So when I was good evening, everyone. I should thank you for everyone for joining this session on a Saturday evening. Might not be the original plan you had in mind, but thank you so much for joining and taking your time through the day to discuss a very vital issue that had been spoken of but still remains an issue in Sri Lanka. So when I was preparing for this session, I had a very interesting thought. Sri Lanka being one of the most religious countries in the world. I mean, not just Sri Lanka, like South Asia as a region, we remain very religious and we believe in religion, deities, and everyone to appeal to our lifestyle and to develop our well being. So, Sri Lanka and South Asian region being one of the very most religious regions in the world, still we remain to be appealing to Lord God, excuse me. Give me a second. Yeah. So Sri Lanka and South Asia region being one of the most religious regions in the world, we worship goddess Lakshmi, hoping it will bring wealth and prosperity to our home. We worship goddess Saraswati, hoping it would bring us prosperity, wisdom, and knowledge. But still, we remain to be one of the very brutalist regions with the highest number of recorded incidents of domestic violence. So I was wondering, where did we do wrong? Where did it go wrong? Being one of the most religious and culturally enriched regions in the world, still approximately 1 in 5 women seem to be victims of some form of domestic, physical, or emotional violence in this region. So I was genuinely concerned and wondering, by being a part of this culturally enriched region, culturally enriched society, where did we do wrong? So, on that depressing thought, let me start our very culturally and timely appropriated discussion on the interconnectedness between cultural narratives and gender based violence. Um, I was wondering, when I say gender based violence, what do you usually imagine? Like in a general setting where husband is engaging in some form of physical violence against the wife. That's the general idea whenever we hear the term gender-based violence. But in reality, gender-based violence is much more deeper and broader than mere physical harm or sexual harm that we think in a setting of a domestic violence incident. Gender-based violence is, in fact, a form of violence that is directed against a person because of that person's gender, specifically because of that person's gender. Whatever the discrimination you may face by being uh, by belonging to a certain gender, but in this case by being a woman, can be identified as gender-based violence. And within this discourse today, we are specifically talking about the gender-based violence against women, which affects women in a particular manner, which affects them their day-to-day lives in a disproportionate manner. It could be sexual harm, physical harm, or even economic harm, psychological harm, or in general suffering against women. Mind you, when I talk about women, it's not because gender-based violence is specifically targeting women, but today the discourse is about the gender-based violence against women. That's why the discourse today is limited to women. But that actually the gender-based violence concept itself is very broader, and in different contexts, it can be applicable to even men or any person who's identified beyond the general spectrum of men and women. So that with that notion, let's talk about the cultural element of gender-based violence or how both are interlinked. Specifically, like I said, by being a part of a country that is South Asian, religious, and culturally enriched from birth to death, even after the death, our lives are very shaped and impacted by the culture, right? So automatically, even our behavior on a day-to-day basis could also be impacted by the culture. From the moment we step out of the house, if you're living with your parents, then we tend to worship them and then bid them goodbye when we are leaving the house, right? And in any good moment of your life, if it's a wedding or a exam or anything, we tend to appeal to our cultural aspects, right? So, with that way, our behavior is naturally impacted by the said cultural denominations. So, as a result, when it is a very positive thing, I'm not saying the cultural embracing the culture is a bad thing. What I'm saying is, by being a part of a very cultural enriched society, it has its own downfall in a certain way. In this case, gender-based violence also tend to be interconnected or in some manner influenced, or let's think of a better word than influence, maybe motivated or enticed or enriched by the culture itself. So, for instance, few examples if I'm thinking out loud: child marriage, or even Sati Puja in India, or even honor killing in India, or which those are mainly the physical and sexual harm that can be connected with the cultural inducing. So I was thinking maybe we have to get into a broader discussion as to how would these cultural narratives or these traditions could induce or influence such gender-based violence. When we talk about the societal traditions inducing gender-based violence, of course, there are the usual negative, directly physical harm induced violence forms, such as the female genital mutilation or honor killing, sati puja, so on and so forth. So, you may not know this, or you are probably aware of this already, but even in Sri Lanka, it's not the female genital mutilation is no longer limited to Africa. It is being implemented in the Sri Lankan context too. But this remains unspoken because most of the time these are being conducted outside the urban areas, mostly in rural areas. So these ritual practices in millennia ago, maybe not millennia, but decades ago, centuries ago, that were accepted as okay as the general practice, it has already it has always been some form of gender-based violence option. So that's one way we could see how the cultural narratives have impacted the and perpetuated the gender-based violence by way of female genital mutilation or honor-based violence. Honor-based violence, in case you don't know, it's where the patriarchy of the family or the father of the family sort of acts like the dominant figure of the family. And whenever, if it's a woman, like a daughter or the wife or anyone who harms the reputation of the said father in the name of protecting the honor of the family, the males in the family tend to kill or take the lives of the daughter or the female figure just for the sake of protecting the honor. It could be for very simple, minor reasons, but still, for the sake of protecting the honor, the family's patriarchy tends to kill their own kid over than not. It's mostly the father or the elder brother of the family tends to engage in such actions. So, this is again a very basic and simple form of physical violence that we have heard of, that we have created laws to prevent. But in a very psychological sense, the second and fourth options I have mentioned, patriarchal norms and toxic masculinity, remains to sort of influence the general day-to-day lives that sort of generalize the concept of gender bias violence, which causes grave emotional scars and suffering in the general sense, which, and in fact, this tends to be like very unspoken of, or has, yeah, it tends to be unspoken most of the time because we think it's okay, we think it's the general way, and we tend to sort of generalize and normalize the toxic masculinity, saying this has been the way for the past, I don't know for how long. Therefore, it needs to remain this way because it has been our culture. So, the second point, patriarchal norms and toxic masculinity, remains one of the very unspoken but very vital form of narrative, a cultural narrative that induce the gender-based violence. And when you really break down the whatever the other forms of physical or sexual or economical harm, like everything, patriarchal norms and toxic masculinity seem to be the root cause that was induced by the culture or the traditions. Again, I must highlight, I'm not saying by any point cultural narratives or embracing one's culture is a bad thing necessarily. What I'm saying is it has its own perks as well as the own downside is there. So finally, again, another example would be the early or forced marriages as culturally justified, which in South Asian region, we have about 290 million children who have been forced to marry at a very early age. So South Asian region remains one of the regions with the highest number of child marriages. Again, we tend to justify it as some form of culturally appropriated measure to protect one's heritage, inheritance, family, so on and so forth. So that again remains one of the crucial, mostly spoken of, but yet we haven't done anything policy wise to protect or prevent. So these four areas I thought might be like a very general, we have seen, we have not spoken of, ways of cultural narratives which had perpetuated gender-based violence. Yeah. And so moving on to the key findings, I thought of since we sort of familiar with Sri Lankan culture and Sri Lankan, Indian and Bangladesh, Pakistan, I thought of taking the countries and as a like region, countries in the region as a whole, so we can sort of discuss how it had been the practice so far. Yeah. So how it has been the practice over the centuries, just to sort of give me a second. Yeah. So then I have taken sort of for the sake of this session, I took four countries in the region, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, to draw your attention to the cultural narratives using certain examples. For instance, we have seen the dowry systems in Sri Lanka, even in India, and the South Asia as a whole. So most of the honor killings or domestic violence, women are being subjected to such domestic violence incidents simply because the root cause might be a dowry reason, or maybe the spouse is not getting an adequate dowry according to his books or something like this. So most of the time, we tend to see that the so-called cultural phenomena that a woman, the wife, needs to give the dowry to the husband remains one of the vital reasons, the grassroots reasons that induces domestic violence. So this cultural phenomena in one's mind that women are subordinate to the man, therefore, in case of a marriage, the husband needs to be given a certain wealth for the sake of take caring of the woman. That sort of implies the fact that the husband is actually the superior being. Therefore, if his he therefore the for the sake of the marriage, for the sake of the woman being taken care of, he needs to be given a financial inducement. So this has been like a very cultural induced root cause in the region itself, South Asian region itself, which remains one of the vital reasons. And moving on to the Indian case related incidents. In fact, in India, the by way of Dowry Prohibition Act of 1961, giving or receiving dowry is prohibited. So India had taken care of this address this issue through the policy changes. But still, in the rural and urban areas, it remains the practice. Therefore, like it shows that having only the law or the act is not sufficient to ensure the protection of women, right? So this is a point that I wanted to highlight. Having the law itself is not sufficient to protect and ensure that women are being safe. And we can see this graph, like it shows how it shows the total number of reported dowry deaths. Like I said, it remains a root cause. And survey actually shows that 6,753 women in the year of 2021 had been victims of dowry related deaths in India. The law had addressed it, and the activists are speaking of it. Still, this remains a vital issue probably without solution, right? So this is induced and encouraged by the way of cultural phenomena that we face and see in the region. And moving on to Pakistan, like I said, gender based violence takes many forms: physical harm, sexual harm, and even general suffering and economic harm is again, both are some form of gender based violence. Violence does not mean getting beaten up by a person, it has a broader spectrum, like I said. So in Pakistan, we can see a misinterpretation of Islamic texts. Even in the Sri Lankan context or even the South Asian region itself, we can see how the Islamic text as well as other religious texts are often being misinterpreted by extremists. So that overall gives a very negative connotation to certain religions, because such misinterpretation also harm the freedom and the intellectual capacity of the women itself. For instance, in Pakistan, although Pakistan has the largest population in Asia, approximately 80% of the female population had never participated in the labor market, which creates some form of economic harm. It creates a dependency of the women, and subsequently 130 million girls between the age of 6 to 17 have not never even attended any form of educational institutions as well. So this sorts of violates one's right to education, right to have a decent living condition, right to have freedom, like freedom of any sort to create an equal life as opposed to men. So everything is restricted in a way, creating this general suffering of women. So this sort of can be boiled down to one grassroots connection, because even though we have the UDHR, United Universal Declaration of Human Rights, CEDAW conventions, or any other conventions, like international standards remains very powerful and very vocal about the prevention of gender-based violence. These cultural phenomena, cultural beliefs that remain for centuries in this region, they sort of overpower the whatever the set international standards, specifically in rural areas. So this creates a very how would I say this? Like a very situation where even the laws remain impracticable to implement, right? So often than not, specifically in this case, what I want to highlight often than not is how the religious context, even the cultural phenomena tend to be misinterpreted, because it leaves room to be misinterpreted, and thereby indirectly it sort of damages and induce the protection and the rights of women. So that is one area that Pakistan serves as an ideal case study. And moving on to Bangladesh. So Bangladesh has a very um, again a culturally appropriated misappropriated view where husbands right as the superior being in the household to dominate his wife in both private and public life. So this vast process remains to be misinterpreted in the cultural denominations, cultural notions, and as well as religious texts to supplement their hypermasculine views online. So again, Bangladesh is one example where religion and culture tends leaves room to be misinterpreted and thereby causing women to be harassed and violated over the time and time. And talking about Sri Lanka, we have seen specifically during the war inflicted period, Sri Lankan women, particularly Tamil women, faced grievous physical and sexual violence. Like we saw forced prostitution, domestic and international sex trafficking. For instance, by the time of 2010, there were about 89,000 war widows and 40,000 women managing households in the former war zone. Between 2009 to 2013, the number of sexual violence related police complaints were increased by 34%. So, even in Sri Lankan context, no matter how the legal framework is strengthened enough to address violence against women, the practical difficulties of said implementation, like said laws, remains a major issue, restricting the implementation of these laws. So these are how the cultural denominations and traditional societal norms tend to sort of overpower the applicable laws. And like I said, I'm not saying embracing the culture is a bad thing. Oh, it's not something we need to avoid altogether. But because South Asian region and Sri Lankans, as we have a very enriched culture, we need to embrace what we are, right? But at the same time, we need to maintain a very possible, maybe impossible balance between the traditions and the said harmful practices. Because we have seen how the cultural norm of which tends to generalize the gender-based violence, right? We have heard the phrase, men, boys will be boys, you know, like, so whenever there is an incident of domestic violence, we tend to see it as maybe the woman must have done something wrong. Maybe it's woman's fault. Or maybe obviously the woman had done something wrong and the man is just reacting. So this has been like the general connotation in the society whenever there's a gender domestic violence incident, right? And whenever we see like toxic masculinity features at a young age, we tend to see that's how people should react, that's how men should be. Otherwise, it's not appropriate for a man to show emotions, it's not appropriate for a man to be vulnerable. So, with that sort of fixed and rigid mindset, we tend to generalize the concept of gender-based violence or text. We tend to generalize the toxic masculinity concept itself, which indirectly supplement the gender-based violence, right? So therefore, with the cultural, while maintaining cultural traditional approach, we need to maintain a very secure place within our culture itself to protect and ensure the safety and equality of women. So, like I said, culture leaves room to be misinterpreted, right? So the local needs leaders, from in my perspective at least, the local leaders needs to be contacted by the government because conducted by the government authorities to ensure that whatever the legal changes are actually communicated and interpreted in such way where the local leaders could be the advocates of such changes, right? And because evidently whatever the legal changes, legal reforms are not sufficient to protect the women from gender-based violence. Therefore, the local leaders or the at a grassroots level, in if it's the Sri Lankan context, at the Grama Sevaka level, grassroots level, Grama Sevaka and the local authorities needs to sort of speak to their community leaders and sort of create a dialogue to shift the perspective. Because like the laws might be strengthened or law might be very vocal about prevention of gender-based violence, but if we don't change the perspective of the public itself, if we don't change the perspective of the religious leaders, communities, in then whatever the policy changes might not be sufficient, because the community level itself is where the cultural denominations, cultural notions tend to primarily develop them. So there needs to be a perfect balance. And for that balance to happen, we believe that role of education and awareness campaigns play a very vital role, because it's not easy to change the perspective of someone who had been living in for decades, right? So education and awareness campaigns tend to slowly change the perspective overall by way of ideally engaging media to spotlight the gender equality or importance of grassroots movements led by survivors. This needs to be given priority because the public campaigns that dismantle myths such as the hashtag MeToo, no means no, that tends to educate the general public and communities to redefine the masculinity. And whatever the campaigns that the civil sector do, and the campaigns like these led by the International Youth Alliance for Peace, they tend to change the perspective of people, of the communities, to identify that it is wrong to generalize gender-based violence. So that needs to happen parallel with the policy changes. I'm not saying policy changes are pointless. Policy changes are important, but at the same time, education and awareness campaigns need to change the perspective of the general public, because the law is there, but implementation remains an issue. That brings me to the legal perspective, the legal framework of this matter. We have this recent law, Women Empowerment Act of 2024, and the DOL Prevention of Domestic Violence Act 2005. And the international law is there for CEDAW, UDHR, so on and so forth. And of course, we have the National Plan for Women, Peace and Security, and the personal law aspect, Thesavalami Code, MMDA, Canadian law, so on and so forth. These laws are established to ensure the strengthening of and protection of women in the Sri Lankan context. So my presentation in this discourse is limited to the Sri Lankan context, and um, like specifically the Thesalami Code MMDA, it sort of addresses how the cultural laws are implemented and incorporated the gender law, right? So Thesalami focuses on the communities inhabitants of Malabar, and MMDA applies to the Muslims who are residing and inhabitants in Sri Lanka. And Kandyan law applies as a territorial law within the Kandyan provinces, Kandyan region, right? So these three laws remain the cultural implementation of the cultural, personal laws in Sri Lanka, right? And there are certain negative connotations to these laws. For instance, the Tesalami Code does not allow women to own property in certain situations, like where inheritance is questionable. And MMDA indirectly enables child marriages. And same goes with Canadian law. There are certain misfortunes that needs to be addressed. But on the plus side, we have a very legally, I would say legally accomplished Prevention of Domestic Violence Act of 2005, which interprets the domestic violence in a very broader set. But unfortunately, the implementation of this Prevention of Domestic Violence Act remains an issue because, again, with the cultural narrative that if I am a victim of domestic violence, immediately I think twice before going to police, right? Oh, I think twice before filing an action before the magistrate court. Because the law requires, Prevention of Domestic Violence Act requires a victim of domestic violence to file an action, file a case before the magistrate court of their jurisdiction. So I can obtain a restraining order, interim order, after I seek legal counsel and make my submission before the magistrate court. So if I am a victim of domestic violence and if I require a restraining order, my barriers are I should be able to afford a lawyer, right? So if, let's say, I'm a school girl or young person who's being subjected to domestic violence by a boyfriend, then I should be able to, I won't have the capacity to afford a legal support, right? And I will not be able to go to the police or plead my case before a police officer because in our mind, I would think twice because I'm not saying I will, but I'm just saying this is the general notion in the society, right? I would think twice going to police because how can I speak about this out loud? How can I speak about like a very personal act conducted by an intimate partner of mine? So this remains very taboo concepts in our mind. So we think twice before seeking help by law enforcement, right? What would people say? How would it affect my future if I sort of speak out about whatever the physical, emotional, sexual harm that I have encountered? How can I marry again? How can I get into a relationship again? Oh, what would people say? Again, it comes down to the traditional societal norms as to how it would affect the reputation of yourself or the future of yourself. So we tend to, whatever the legal framework is there, despite the legal framework, we tend to think twice before taking an action. So we can talk about the legal reforms, the need to have legal reforms, all we want, but practically the cultural narratives that were implanted in our mind, it sort of restrains us from taking an action. Like I said earlier, 1 in every 5 women have experienced some form of physical harm, sexual harm from their spouse. That is only the reported number of cases. How many cases, how many incidents do you think there are that didn't even got reported in the first place? So this is where the cultural narratives becomes a negative connotation because it sort of become implanted in our brain that it is okay not to take an action against your spouse. It's okay not to take an action against a man because it's a very normal thing. That's how they show emotions. This is how they take care of they take care of us, right? Like not having a choice to work, not having a choice to make a living or economically be independent because your spouse or your father or the culturally significant men say so or women say so, that is normal, right? I'm not saying it's not okay, but the culture had made us believe that it is noble, it is generalized. If your spouse restricts your freedom, restricts your ability to have a decent livelihood by yourself, to make a financially independent person, if they prevent you from going to work, make an earning, that's then it must be because he really loves me. That's the general idea that had been generalized for decades, right? Because that supersedes the legal framework that is there to prevent the domestic violence and other forms of gender based violence, because culture had implanted and had sort of manipulated our brain to think this is the general way. In fact, it is not. So, this is why the legal framework needs to be strengthened. At the same time, the sustainable change requires the societal change, societal difference of change in the perspective. So I can talk about legal reforms all day, which remains the first stage of a sustainable change. But at the same time, we need to address the policy changes, grassroots mobilization, technological integration. I'll explain this, but we need to address, like, we need to have a holistic approach to protect victims of gender based violence, because otherwise it will not be sufficient. That's what I have been trying to say for past 1 hour, that legal reforms itself is not sufficient. Because have a look at India, the dowry system. It's prevented. Satyapuja is prevented. It's prohibited. Honor killing is prohibited. But still it's happening because at an urban, rural level, since the perspective is not changed, people tend to do so despite the fact that it's prohibited. So legal reforms remains one, but for the sake of having a sustainable change, we need other layers of indifferences. For instance, policy changes. If if I go to the police and when I try to report a domestic violence incident, the general response of the police is, "What did you do wrong?" If it is that such response, then I will never go to a police again, and nor will I ever ask anybody else to seek law enforcement protection, because if that's how they are operating, right? So the with regards to in terms of the legal reforms, policy changes are also vital, because gender sensitive training for the law enforcement is required. The police need to be more sensitive to handling the gender based violence approaches, and also the judiciary needs to be applying a human rights based approach. They need to have a gender sensitive training even in the deciding a judgment, or even in obtaining the evidence or hearing evidence, so on and so forth. So legal reforms and policy changes needs to be first and second, and then change in the perspective, because grassroots mobilization is where we could make the real change. Because therefore that we need to collaborate with the grassroots leaders, community leaders, and the government needs to play a vital role in this. Because without the community level support, whatever the legal changes we have will not be sufficient, right? And in addition to the grassroots mobilization, we need to have infrastructure, because we saw during the COVID period where the women do not have any option of lodging a complaint, domestic violence incidents were skyrocketed. But still, there's no way for them to take shelter or avert the crisis. So imagine when you have to live with the perpetrator in a lockdown situation with no remedies. So therefore, we as a region, we need to have infrastructure. We need to have hotline services, essential services, which is strengthened and empowered enough to address these concerns 24/7. And we have this app, like moving on to the technological integration, I think there is a app which sort of enables you to report like incidents occur on the road or something like that. I'm not sure what it is, but we need to have apps for safe reporting and support. Specifically, a support system needs to remain there. And like I said, the supporting the victims with the financial resources to make complaints. The Legal Aid Commission is there, but still the awareness about the said approaches, said entities, so we could take the legal remedies for free. It needs to go out there, right? Because if the approach to, or like, if the process of obtaining a restraining order against the perpetrator requires to spend like few lakhs, few hundred thousands to seek legal help and go before the magistrate court of your jurisdiction, only a handful of women could actually afford to do that. So there are financial resources, but it needs to be locally aware of. So the Qatar carry out programs, like programs need to be carried out to raise awareness. These are the remedies you can do. These are the remedies that are available for you if you need to do this. So that needs to be done. But at the same time, it needs to be, I'm sorry, there is a question. Are there any criteria or limit? What issues should be reported and what should not be reported? So, when you say reported incidents, it's the number of complaints, right? If there are, like, if the parties have reported the incident as they have been some victim of domestic violence or gender-based violence, that had been the number, right? So it comes down to the number of complaints made to the National Child and Women Protection Authority, police stations, or the complaints, like all the cases that were filed before the magistrate court. Though that's how it had been calculated, this is the number of reported cases, so on and so forth. But like I said, I hope this sort of addresses your concern, Imtiaz. But realistically, the number of unreported cases as a number of incidents where the victims did not go to police, did not seek protection by any of the governmental authorities, that is way higher than the actual reported incidents. And the reason why they were not reported in the first place is because of this cultural connotation we have in mind, that it's not easy to be a victim of domestic violence. It's not easy to be a victim of gender-based violence. So these cultural phenomena that keep on influencing our mindset tend to be a deterrent against the victims of domestic violence and other forms of gender-based violence from seeking help through the law enforcement. So this is why we need to have very strengthened strategies that takes a holistic approach where the legal reforms are enforced, at the same time policy changes are done, but at the same time the grassroots mobilization, infrastructure, integration of technology, so on and so forth needs to also be implemented. So the perspective of the communities, perspective of the society, we shall also be little bit more progressive than where we are now. So this is my approach so far. And I want to highlight few things. The reason why this connotation was entirely restricted to gender-based violence against women is because this is the discourse for it. It does not entail that gender-based violence is only against women. No. And the cultural and societal narratives are not always a negative connotation, but it has its ups and it has its downs. And one of the downfalls is such that it holds a very laid back and negative mindset against gender-based violence. I think our time's up to the dot. Are there any questions?
Yes, Ms. Sachinri, thank you so much for that insightful presentation. And truly, that presentation has so much of informations. And personally, we have learned so much information from that. And basically, I completely agree with your point that normalizing violence through phrases like boys will be boys and men will be men is really harmful. And personally, I agree with that phrase. And also, it's crucial to challenge these narratives to create a safer environment for everyone, as you said. And basically, we have got few questions from our participants. So before that, we'll be ending our live stream for now. And thank you so much, our participants who have participated through live streaming. And for registered participants, now you can engage with Q&A, maybe a quick session due to time restraint. And I think we got few questions.